What is up, y'all? This is the History Zone with Zane Rossler, and thanks for joining today. On today's episode, we'll be talking about a lesser-known tragedy of the Civil Rights Movement, one involving fire, college students, and a bowling alley. This episode is the Orangeburg Massacre. Before we start with the episode itself, it's best to bring some background on Orangeburg, South Carolina. The first thing to know about Orangeburg, South Carolina is that it is not a very big town. It usually rounds out to around 13,000 people. One thing to note about Orangeburg, South Carolina is that it is home to two historically black universities, Claflin College, a private university, and South Carolina State University, then called South Carolina State College, the only public black university in South Carolina. This is the setting of South Carolina's most under-the-radar tragedy. We'll then go to 1964 with the signing of the Civil Rights Act, which was supposed to desegregate many parts of the South that had whites-only signs in it. This legislation was supposed to uproot the racial hierarchy that had defined South Carolina. However, the white supremacy that still held power in South Carolina was less than willing to cooperate with a law that they thought would take them from their top position. As a result, there were several holdouts of segregation by the late 60s in South Carolina, which is where we're going to start our story for today. One of the main centers of our story in Orangeburg is going to be a place called All-Stars Bowling Lane. This establishment was of course, a bowling lane, but also a snack bar run by a man named Harry Floyd. Harry Floyd was a segregationist who wanted to keep his bowling lane white. Of course, by the time the 1964 Civil Rights Act had come out, he could no longer say whites only. Instead, he held a sign that said privately owned in his bowling alley. That way, he can say as a private owner, he could decide who and who doesn't enter. It just so happened that the people who could enter his bowling alley were all white, and it was just a coincidence that the people he turned away were the black students there. As South Carolina was slowly, but of course gradually moving away from a whites-only segregation, Harry Floyd was someone who believed that segregation would be the law of the land until his dying day, even after it. He also tried to find as many loopholes around the Civil Rights Act as he could. One loophole was that anything that was interstate or required interstate commerce could not be segregated. Floyd thought that his case was strong because he claimed that most of his customers were local instead of out-of-state tourists. Of course, that law really didn't matter to Floyd. He was adamant about keeping his bowling lane separate. You would hear a lot of arguments, like the fact that a lot of tourists out of state who were white patronized his establishment, the fact that his food and the parts to his bowling alley were made out of state, but that really never mattered to Floyd. He still believed that he could run a profitable business by admitting whites only, and he also believed that if he had an establishment whites only and he integrated it, that would hurt his bottom line. Despite his stubbornness to keep his bowling alley segregated, that wouldn't stop the students who were young and fired at Claflin College and more notably South Carolina State College. By February of 1968, South Carolina State College had replaced its previous president who kept students on a tight leash with someone who was a bit more lenient with letting the students protest. Also worth noticing is a man named Cleveland Sellers had come to help the students organize to fight segregation in South Carolina. Sellers had grown up in Denmark, South Carolina, with a black family that was well off, or at least as well off as a black family could do in South Carolina during Jim Crow. He then joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, aka SNCC, one of the many civil rights organizations at the time, as a means to help fight segregation. During his time in activism, he started developing a more black power aesthetic to what he did. This included things like wearing an afro, growing out his mustache, and taking a more confrontation against segregation and white supremacy itself. He even started his own version of SNCC, the Black Awareness Coordinating Committee. he only managed to get around 18 members from South Carolina State College, but the fact that his organization was granted charter by the new president was surprising even to the students at the time. As a result of having only around 20 members in a college that had hundreds of students, Cleveland Sellers had very minimal influence over their political action. One of the more notable students that led the charge was a guy named John Stroman. Stroman was a senior at South Carolina State College, and he was a prolific bowler. In his hometown of Savannah, Georgia, he participated in league bowling. And because All-Star Lane was segregated, he would even break curfew to drive about an hour north to Columbia just to find a place where he could bowl as a black man. To him and many other black students in the area, the segregated bowling alley stood as a symbol as a state that refused to change and treat them like human beings. As a result, they actually started to act. They needed to show that Floyd's members-only policy was just a ruse to keep black people out of his bowling alley. Fortunately, South Carolina State College did have a white student, so they decided to send the white student on Monday the 5th of February, 1968, to see what would happen. Despite only having a members-only policy, Floyd did not ask said white student to have a membership. He actually let him bowl. Shortly afterward, his black classmates would start entering the bowling alley. The staff and Floyd especially were not pleased with this. The staff at All Stars would treat the black students as any other staff member of any institution had before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They would ignore them, they would treat them badly, and tell them to leave. The black students did point out the hypocrisy that Floyd had let their white classmate use the bowling alley, but he pretty much refused to acknowledge the humanity of their own. Floyd just decided to call the police and close his bowling alley for the night. This, however, did not deter the students from trying to integrate the bowling alley. On Tuesday of that week, they would try a more aggressive approach. The students, as a whole, would try to enter the bowling alley as a large group. However, before the students could enter, the doors were locked, and they were told to leave by the police chief at the time, Roger Poston. And when the students wouldn't leave, the police decided to arrest the students instead. And the students who managed to evade being arrested decided to stage a sit-in, which was very unsuccessful. Despite all the trouble that keeping his bowling alley a segregated institution had brought, Floyd was adamant that he did not need to serve black people. He even complained to the city government and said that the 1964 Act technically didn't mean that he had to serve them. The black students, especially the one the police had arrested, were also adamant that Floyd needed to desegregate. However, their pleas to the city government didn't get them anywhere where they needed to be. Therefore, Floyd could keep his bowling alley segregated for another day. By the time the Thursday the 8th came, that's when things would start really going down. Ironically, at this night, the students would not go to a bowling alley, but instead an empty lot right next to an abandoned house and an L-shaped road. The students decided that they would protest by starting a bonfire in the middle of the night right next to this vacant lot. Once police heard of this, they decided they needed to respond in full force, especially considering that there were incidents of people saying that the students had broken glass and started throwing bricks in windows earlier that week. And by full force, they actually brought in not only state troopers but the National Guard. Also by full force, this meant stronger weapons. For the police and state troopers, most of them had .38 revolvers, but they also had shotguns with buckshots so strong that it could kill large animals. And for the National Guard, they had M1 rifles with fixed bayonets. When the fire truck was called to put out the bonfire, that's when, at least according to the police, which should be taken with a grain of salt, that things actually started to devolve. An officer named Sheely had been struck with a banister, and as a result, police said that they had been attacked. They started shooting, and the rest of the police, believing that they had been firing on, started shooting against the unarmed protesters. As soon as the students started hearing gunfire, they started fleeing. The nurse at South Carolina State College was very overwhelmed because she had to treat students who were dealing with gunshots instead of the usual college sickness. And those who couldn't make it to the infirmary, they decided to go to the hospital, which was also segregated, meaning they had to sit in separate waiting rooms, even though some of them were dying or suffering because of gunshot wounds. This resulted in the deaths of 3 students. Samuel Hammond Jr., age 18, freshman from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, shot in the upper back. Delano Middleton, 17, from Orangeburg High School, son of a college maid, shot in the spine, thigh, wrist, and forearm. Henry Smith, age 18, from Marion, South Carolina, shot in the right torso and left side of the neck. There were about 27 more casualties, or not casualties in this case, injuries. Injuries where all but one student was shot in the back by the police. This, of course, angered the black community in the area. However, the police were doing damage control in a still very segregated South Carolina. In fact, according to the state, the newspaper in Columbia, the black students were firing at the police, some even saying that snipers were shooting at the police. However, that was absurd because only one police got hit by a banister, and no police or National Guardsmen were ever killed as a result of what happened that night. Even prominent people like, at the time, the governor of South Carolina, Robert McNair, were adamant that things like this would happen if outside agitators, as the previously mentioned Cleveland Sellers, didn't come to South Carolina, and especially Orangeburg, to stir up protests and make people angry and disturbing the supposed order believed by many of the white South Carolinians at the time. 9 police officers were charged for the events of that night. They had their trials set in Florence County, South Carolina. This way they can avoid Orangeburg, where all of it happened and nobody could be objective, but also away from Columbia, where 2 black HBCUs exist, and they were also very angry about what had happened, and therefore nobody in the Columbia area could be objective on what happened. The judge in this case was a man named Judge Martin, and for a South Carolina judge, the best way to describe him is that he was devoted to the law. If the law said that you could segregate people from your establishment, he would allow it. But if the law said that you couldn't segregate, he would say that you couldn't segregate. The prosecutors in this case, one of them was a young man named Quaintance. He was young and competent, but did not have the experience one would need to successfully convict 9 police officers in South Carolina for shooting a bunch of black students. The fate of their case, however, held in a jury, which was mostly filled with white people. 10 out of 12 actually were white, and the only 2 black people were from the rural regions, more conservative, and definitely did not represent the students there who were shot. With the deck stacked against the black students, it is obvious that all 9 police officers were found not guilty of shooting the students that night in February of 1968. But that was not the final case involved with what happened at Orangeburg that night in 1968. In 1970, Cleveland Sellers would be tried for not dispersing when the police had ordered the students to do so. Cleveland Sellers was still the perfect scapegoat. He had a black power aesthetic, he wore his afro, his mustache, and when appearing in court, he did not really wear a suit. So it served as no surprise when the mostly white jury decided that Cleveland was guilty. Cleveland was sentenced to serve time behind bars. Fortunately, he got out early because he was a model prisoner and he had good behavior. Fortunately, in 1992, Cleveland Sellers received a pardon, though he decided not to have his records expunged because he saw it as a badge of honor. And in 2002, Jim Hodges, the governor of South Carolina, issued a formal apology for the Orangeburg Massacre of 1968. I know that story was a bit of a bummer, but I hoped you enjoyed it and learned something from it. Thank you for listening to the History Zone with Zane Rossler. The History Zone with Zane Rossler is made possible thanks to the studio from the Richland Downtown Library. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next episode. I hope to see you there. History Zone with Zane Rossler.